I'm sure many of you out there have a few different comfort genres when it comes to video games. For me personally, I could play 3D platformers, kart racers, or Picross pretty much any day of the week. But above all else, if I'm looking for good quick fun, rail shooters are the way to go. High action, great set pieces, tons of variety, all packed into what is usually a very modest runtime. Good, quick fun. The roots of the genre go all the way back to the arcades, with the likes of 1983's vector-based Star Wars game, and of course the granddaddy of modern rail shooters, Yu Suzuki's 1985 mega hit Space Harrier. Now, being a 90s baby myself, my first introduction to rail shooters came during the 5th generation of consoles, with the N64 offering up two of the all-time greats with Star Fox 64 and Treasure's excellent Sin and Punishment. And of course, who could forget Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Zwei, two of the very best games the Saturn has to offer. The PlayStation, on the other hand, not really a console known for its rail shooters. While the console itself was undoubtedly the star of the 5th generation, producing some of the most iconic and influential games of the era, when you think of the best games on the system, rail shooters probably aren't what come to mind. The console's most well-known rail shooter is probably Omega Boost from Polyphony Digital, which you could argue isn't really a rail shooter, but come on guys, it's a rail shooter. Now, Omega Boost is without a doubt an excellent game, one of the console's finest in my opinion, but when you compare its notoriety with the likes of Panzer Dragoon and Star Fox, even this much-loved title is still a relative obscurity within the PlayStation's library. So with the genre flourishing on competing hardware, this would lead us to believe one of two things. Either the PS1 doesn't have that many rail shooters, or the rail shooters that it does have aren't very good. Well, we can rule out the first one because let's not forget, this is the PlayStation we're talking about, and when you've got a few thousand games in your library, naturally it's gonna have more rail shooters than any other console from the generation, just by default. So what's the deal then? Are these games just not that good? Well, I've already tried one of them on the channel called Gamera 2000, and well, I think this is one of my favorite PlayStation games now, so I don't think that's it either. So I thought to myself, maybe it's time we dug into one of these other PS1 rail shooters. I get to play something I'll probably like, we get to show off an obscure game, and it'll likely only take an hour or two to beat. Everybody's a winner. So where do you even begin when deciding on what to play? Well, we could go to the early days of the console with Nova Storm or Jupiter Strike. We could keep up our 50Hz streak and check out the PAL exclusive Space Debris, or we could just pick the one with the coolest title. Yeah, that'll do. Alright, so I didn't just pick this particular game because of the name, although Astro Trooper Vanark is a pretty cool title, let's be fair. I actually chose this one because it never came out in the PAL region, and like most Europeans who find themselves trawling through the PS1 library in the dark hours of the night, eventually you're going to come across a game like Astro Trooper Vanark and go, whoa, what the fuck is this? Although, if we're going to be official, the actual Western title of this game is just Vanark, but the title screen still retains the full Japanese title of Astro Trooper Vanark, so yeah, just pick whichever one you like best. This game comes from both BitTown and Asimic Ace, who mostly worked on more traditional combat flight simulations like the early PS1 release Bogey Dead 6, and they also did LSD of all games. Well, Astro Trooper Vanark isn't very much like either of those games, although if you played Bogey Dead 6 and dropped half a tab of LSD, maybe you'd get a similar experience. Or you might just end up fused into your couch for 12 hours, could go either way. No, Vanark is very much the traditional rail shooter experience that you'd come to expect from this console generation, almost down to a T. And now look, I know your first instinct is to see this game and scream, this is a Star Fox 64 clone, and look, yeah, maybe. But Star Fox 64 was just fancy Star Fox, and Star Fox was just fancy Afterburner, and Afterburner was just a fancy Space Harrier. I know that's being a bit reductive, but hey, so is saying Vanark is just a Star Fox 64 clone on the PS1, you know? It's a genre where games can't help but share a lot of similarities, but the one common denominator for all of these games is that they're all really good. And Vanark here, well, it's packing a little more under the hood than you may think, but more importantly, this game too is also really, really good. Immediately, one thing that sets Vanark apart from other titles in the genre is its bigger emphasis on story. This, at its core, is still a fast-paced arcade shooter, but in between missions you also get to wander around your mothership with these lovely pre-rendered backgrounds and delightful 3D models kitted out with, you guessed it, vintage tank control goodness. Wander around your ship, chat to the crew members, or just watch fish in the lounge. Definitely not something you'd expect from a game like this. It's also kind of funny when this exact same thing was in another PS1 space shooter released around the same time called Star Ixium, but I'm sure we'll get to that game some other day. Now, you might wonder how well the story and combat sections mesh together, because I wouldn't blame you for thinking that these breaks in between missions might upset the flow of the traditional rail shooter formula, where you flow quickly from one level to another with usually little more than a few seconds to catch your breath before you're right back into the thick of it. Well, Vanark actually manages to balance this pretty well, I feel. I was a little apprehensive at first because this is something they could very easily drop the ball with if the story and characters were terrible, but you know what, it ain't half bad. They also might have gone all out on the CGI budget for this game because these story cutscenes aren't messing around. So the plot itself is relatively straightforward. Have you ever heard of this thing called global warming? Well yeah, that happened, so it's off to Mars for humanity to start fresh. Of course, humans, they just can't help destroying a good planet, so naturally, a bunch of rogue scientists decided to change the ecosystem of Mars, which kind of resulted in it kickstarting the Jurassic era all over again, but on Mars, in the year 2200. Also, on a separate note, aliens are firing giant asteroids at Mars using a big space gun. It's not the best time for the Mars Defense Force, I gotta say. So you take the role of Shun, which I imagine is the Japanese variation of my name. It's more or less the same. It's up to you and your MDF pals to save Mars from the creatures that have begun to pop up and also take out the devices causing all of these issues, which happen to be located in a hidden base called Laboratory X. This is just another one of Dr. X's crazy schemes, isn't it? When the story isn't playing out during cutscenes and ominous text scrolls, it'll be playing out between your crew on the mothership in between missions. Now the thing is, while Vanark certainly leans in on its plot and quieter character moments, this is still a pretty fast-paced game. The story isn't really filled with any fluff, for better or for worse. The game does offer up twists and turns every now and then, but if you're looking for a proper character development or any depth to these people, you're just not gonna find it here. And while I did enjoy it for what it was, if you wanted to skip over these parts of the game, they at least aren't gonna get in your way. Now soon into starting the game, you get taken to a training simulator, which really looks like one of those weird white simulator rides they'd have out in shopping centres in the 90s. Anybody remember these things, or am I just going crazy? When I think back, my local shopping centre also had a talking tree, so maybe I am crazy. As you'd expect, the game's training mission teaches you everything you need to know about gameplay going forward. Here's how you fly, here's how you shoot, that's about all there is to it. Vanark definitely takes a more straightforward approach to the gameplay department. One button for each of your weapons, the ability to speed up and slow down, and then the D-pad for all of your movements. No fancy barrel rolls or evasive maneuvers here. Simplicity is key, but that doesn't mean that the game lacks depth. On the contrary, Vanark is going to make you master all your ship abilities very quickly because this game is not afraid to fuck you up. Vanark, for lack of a better word, is intense. Big enemies, environmental hazards, lots and lots of bullets. Vanark is a game that likes to keep you on your toes. From the very first level, you'll realize this game is not messing around. Your only way to prevent damage is quick reactions, careful control of your speed, and precise aiming. And to add to the pressure, this is a game with limited continues, and also no way to heal mid-mission. And since most missions in this game are a little longer than your average rail shooter, you really want to be focused at all times. Mercifully dying does place you at a nearby checkpoint, but if you're out of continues, that ain't gonna do you much good. You've got to survive through 7 levels across 6 chapters, traveling through the monster-ridden jungles of Mars, industrial landscapes, and of course you can't have a space shooter without some underwater segments. And a whole lot of lava, of course. And
Space!
As we covered previously, your craft in Vanark only has 2 attacks, which unsurprisingly are a very reliable rapid fire laser for dealing concentrated damage and clearing oncoming hazards, and a homing weapon that allows you to paint some targets for some oh so satisfying lock-on damage. Both attacks are genre classics for sure, but there's a little bit more to the weapons than what meets the eye. You see, prior to every mission, you have the choice to equip your ship with a variety of different auto-fire and lock-on weaponry. This allows you to tailor your weapons to your individual playstyle. You can sacrifice some damage on your lock-on weapon, but it now recharges quicker and is able to paint more targets simultaneously. You can get a more powerful laser that shoots slower, so to really maximize its potential you gotta be more accurate with your shots. This customization is available pretty much from the very start, but better yet, as you move through the game you begin to unlock even more weapons to choose from. Of course, the newer weapons do quickly outclass your older models, but by the end of the game you'll have a pretty vast selection to choose from before entering into battle. Of course, I'm the kind of guy whose favourite flavour of ice cream is vanilla, so happily I opt to stick with the upgraded versions of your standard lasers and rockets throughout most of the game. But the added weapons both add some nice variety for multiple playthroughs and a nice sense of progression as well, even adding cool new visual touches to your ship from mission to mission. That's not all though. Prior to every mission, you also need to pick an operator who will act as your guide throughout the level. Early into the game, you only have access to 2, but as you complete new levels, you start to recruit more to your team, giving you a total of 4 to choose from, each with varying experience of one of 4 different skills: combat ability, enemy analysis, route analysis, and actual combat experience. Depending on which operator you choose for a mission, you may get useful intel on an upcoming branching path or a full rundown of the boss's weak points. Honestly, these didn't feel like they had a huge impact on the gameplay overall, but I think as a concept, it's a pretty cool addition that does add some extra variety and replayability. And speaking of variety, the game also has these odd minigames that play into the story segments. There's only 2 of these in total and both are quite short. One of them is kind of a throwaway segment where you're trying to restore oxygen to your ship within a time limit. The concept itself is fine, it's just that there's only 3 rooms to go to. One is empty, the other is a jump scare, I think, and reaching the final room ends the section successfully. Going to all 3 of these rooms only takes a fraction of the allotted time limit, so there's basically no challenge to this whatsoever. The next minigame, on the other hand, also kind of a throwaway segment, only losing it is much easier and doing so has bad consequences. Right about midway into the game, you rescue this pilot from a downed carrier and bring the pilot and carrier onto your mothership. But it turns out the enemy has actually booby-trapped the ship and somehow connected it to the pilot's brainwave, so by waking him up, you have now got to disarm a bomb real quick. So this bomb section, the goal itself is very simple. You gotta guide this little ball to the end of the maze without touching the walls or the green balls that go side to side. I guarantee you, the first time you try this, you'll probably get caught off by the heavy momentum on your ball and just run straight into a wall. Now this happens once, you're done. The bomb goes off and guess what? Nobody gets injured and there's no game over. But you do lose all of your upgraded weapons up until that point, which let me tell you, fucking sucks. Now if you're diligent in saving all the time like a crazy person, this won't be too much of an issue, but if you're not prepared for this section and forget to save beforehand, this tough game is about to get a whole lot tougher. Now let's just say you are prepared and know what you're doing. This maze is still pretty damn hard. There's 1 or 2 very difficult parts where you have to dodge multiple balls simultaneously, and believe me, it may look easy, but getting to grips with this thing's momentum, it is a struggle. So yeah, 2 odd minigames that pop up in the middle of the game, and both not great for different reasons, but if you beat the maze at least, you'll feel like a Chad with your cool new lasers. Anyway, speaking of lasers, the core of this game is still all about blasting stuff out of the sky, which is really the only thing that needs to be good in a game like this, and thankfully, it is where the game shines the most. The levels themselves mostly take place across linear environments with you and your starship, but there are also a few levels where you can move freely throughout an arena, and even one that takes place on a bike. No matter what type of level you're in, you can guarantee the control is snappy and responsive. The arena levels in particular have excellent 3D movement, which considering the developer's history with flight sims, isn't all that surprising. This of course means that the one level where you're not flying tends to be the weakest, although here it's only because the bike has a single weapon, which you can only aim on the X-axis for some reason. It's still a fun level that controls well with some great set pieces, but limiting your weapons and movement options just makes it feel a little bit duller than what the flying levels have to offer. But damn, are those flying levels good. As I said, they're a bit longer than what you'd expect from most rail shooters, offering up plenty of mini-bosses as well as a satisfying end boss at the end of each level, but there's always so much going on during a level's runtime that it never feels like it's dragging on or outstaying its welcome. One minute you're blasting down fodder enemies, the next you're navigating through some lava tunnels and controlling your speed to avoid rocks blocking your path. Then all of a sudden you're fighting a big brain with glowing red laser eyes and electricity everywhere. This is what you love to see. Of course, as you'd imagine, the bosses are the definite highlight of the game. I don't think there's a bad fight in the whole thing, from the mini-bosses to the main bosses. The fights are hectic with fun patterns to challenge you, and the visual designs of these things are really on point too. I thought one of the robot fish enemies was an homage to Darius, but then when I ended up fighting another giant golden fish in space, then I knew it was an homage to Darius. It also helps that Vanark is a good looking game with some fine looking models to boot. This obviously is highlighted during the boss battles, but even the player ship and basic enemies look pretty great too. The game really benefits from coming out during the later years of the PlayStation's life cycle, with the Japanese release coming in late 1999 and the North American version in early 2000, and frankly, across the board this is a damn fine looking game. Everything is clean, sharp and detailed, and the game certainly benefits from a level of smoothness to the gameplay that was a struggle to achieve for the rail shooters on the Saturn and N64. Vanark doesn't quite hit the golden 30 FPS mark, but it's sitting nicely within the stable 20s, which is impressive given how hectic the battles can become. Of course, that being said, the game does feature some modest draw distance limitations, which are certainly noticeable throughout, but don't affect the gameplay in any meaningful way, thankfully. Really, my only gripe with the visuals are that the locales themselves can feel a little bit desolate and barren. While the majority of the levels are linear affairs, you oftentimes move through big open areas with very little in them. If this is the compromise for keeping the game speed high and the enemies big and flashy, well then so be it, but they certainly don't make for the most memorable locales I've ever seen. Also, this is kind of a petty gripe, but the HUD isn't the most exciting thing I've ever seen. It's functional and kept out of the way, thankfully, but it kind of looks a little slapped together, which is very at odds with the high production value seen throughout the rest of the game. Of course, when we're talking about the story segments, the visuals here change pretty drastically. The character models here are quite good, but they definitely don't have the same level of detail you'd see from some other notable games released around this time that also feature static backgrounds. But considering all of this is just taking place in the background of a rail shooter, who am I to complain? This is still pretty great. The mothership itself looks really nice. It's not the biggest location in the world, but some of the areas have some great atmosphere and also a great sense of scale. They do a lot with the space that they have, and it ends up making the ship probably the most memorable location in the game for me. It's a shame then that the areas themselves are once again mostly barren with nothing cool or secret to find within them, but as for the overall design of the ship, I think it's really well done. So the presentation is pretty good so far, but what about the music? Rail shooters are known for their music almost as much as their gameplay, so expectations are pretty high going into this one, and thankfully, Vanark does not let up here either. We have a very bombastic sci-fi soundtrack, taking influence from the likes of old Japanese mecha anime all the way up to Star Wars, and it perfectly sets the scene for each of the various levels. The sound effects are on point too. If you like lock-on noises and the resulting sounds of exploding enemies, well then you'll be very happy here. My only issue with the soundtrack is that it doesn't really have what I'd consider a standout track. The soundtrack remains very consistent throughout the runtime, and while everything is very good, the game is missing the iconic standout that games like Star Fox or Panzer Dragoon would have. Heck, even Gamera 2000, that has about 3 of them. Also, I'd recommend maybe turning the sound effects down just a few levels, as they tend to completely drown out the music on the default setting. But on the whole, the music and sound design here, pretty great all round. Really, minus a few hiccups with the minigames, there's really very little default in Vanark's gameplay. As a rail shooter, I think it can stand toe to toe with some of the best of the era. If you're a fan of the genre, you're gonna like this game, plain and simple. Although I also can't help but feel like this game kinda missed out on reaching its full potential too, and it's all down to the story. As I mentioned, this is still a very quick-paced game in spite of the single-player segments. You'll see the end credits in about an hour and a half of playtime, and while that does run a little bit longer than most rail shooters, the story, the characters, and the Mothership hub world just never feel like they're given enough time to feel meaningful in any way. The story starts out interesting, but as the game goes on, it just begins to unravel and fall apart more and more. It almost feels like you're rushing through it to the very end. You get to spend barely any time with your crew and the new members that you pick up along the way, and as we already mentioned, there is pretty much nothing to do on the mothership itself instead of looking around or just triggering the next mission. It also doesn't help that the translation isn't the best you'll ever see, which I think hurts the delivery on the story too. I also wasn't a fan of the way the text is delivered slowly line by line in multiple parts rather than having an entire sentence appear on screen, which makes a lot of the dialogue also read rather awkwardly, I felt. I think these issues could have been remedied by just fully committing to these sections of the game and also making the runtime that little bit longer. The game only has 7 unique levels as it is, which isn't all that many, and while most levels are pretty lengthy, some are also not. If they had pushed the game's runtime from 1 to 2 hours to maybe 3.5 hours, sprinkle in a few extra levels, maybe an extra 45 minutes of story, some things to do around the mothership, and additional dialogue and backstory with your crew, then we could have been onto something pretty special, I feel. I know these suggestions are very at odds with the spirit of rail shooters. It is a risk slowing down the gameplay frequently to delve into more character-driven moments, but I think these sections are what give Vanark its own identity amongst others in the genre, and while the rail shooter behind it is excellent, it's a shame that its more unique sections come off a little half-baked because of it. Although once again I appreciate the ambition and still think these parts add more to the game than they take away. Look, regardless of my issues with the game, I would be happy to recommend Vanark to anybody. If you dismiss this as a Star Fox clone on the PS1, you are doing yourself a disservice. Also, that's kinda dumb anyway, because Star Fox is good. Why wouldn't you want more games like Star Fox? Come on. I would easily put Vanark up on the pedestal alongside Omega Boost and Gamera 2000 as one of the console's very best rail shooters. And if you're looking for a great game to beat in under 2 hours, well, you can't go wrong. Just be careful if you plan on getting a physical copy, there is a good chance you'll be paying the hidden gem tax if you want to play it. Thankfully, the Japanese version is much more affordable. You do lose the ability to understand what's going on, but you still get to fight the golden space fish. Seems like a fair deal.